Broadcasting from Asheville, North Carolina, USA, it's WPVM's 2020 District 11 Candidate Forum. Tonight's moderator is Matt Henson. There are two candidates for the District 11 seat. Madison Cawthorn declined the invitation, so we have gathered video and written statements he has made on issues facing District 11, which stretches from Avery, McDowell, and Rutherford counties all the way over to the Tennessee border. Colonel Morris Davis is here to respond to questions we have of all the important issues facing our communities. WPVM is honored to bring this forum to the community as a non-commercial community station. Our mission is to inform and entertain our listeners.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special broadcast of WPVM's first ever National Candidate Forum for District 11 here in North Carolina. This broadcast is going to be live on our Facebook and YouTube pages, and we will also be coming to you through the radio at 103.7 FM. Tonight, we will have Colonel Davis with us, as Madison Cawthorn has declined to participate. So we will be asking Colonel Davis some questions. Some of these questions will have written and video responses from Madison Cawthorn, along with written and video statements from Mr. Cawthorn as well. So we'll introduce our Democratic candidate for District 11, Colonel Mo Davis. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks, Matt.
So we're going to hop right in unless you have any questions for us.
I'm good to go.
Our first question is about COVID-19, obviously. Mr. Cawthorn, when asked about the COVID-19 threat, responded that his fiancée worked in healthcare and he knows from speaking with her that the threat of the virus was no hoax. But we've seen at his campaign events that it seems most of the social distance practices are not being followed. Colonel Davis, how serious are you about making sure COVID-19 is not spread at your events, and what are you and your staff doing to make sure that your constituents are as safe as possible?
Yeah, I think, the response to COVID-19 is just one of the real sharp contrasts between me and my opponent. As you mentioned, he's largely, and despite what he has said, his actions speak louder than words. And if you looked at the events that, from March when COVID-19 first started popping up in headlines and people became aware of it until right now, he continues to have these mega spreader events where there's no limit on the crowd size. There are few, if any, face masks. There's no social distancing. They're hugging and kissing and handshaking just like there's nothing going on at a time when I believe I saw today the death tolls up to 222,000 Americans have lost their lives to COVID-19. And to put that in perspective, if you recall, we had 11 investigations of Benghazi where, tragically 4 Americans were killed, and it was appropriate to try to find the lessons to be learned from what happened in Benghazi. But we've had the equivalent of 55,000 Benghazis since March. And you still have people like Mr. Cawthorn and Dan Forest and President Trump who continue just to show a total disregard for public health and public safety. And it's a real tragedy that this has been treated as a political issue rather than a public health issue. So I think it's been a real damper on, I've never run for office before, so campaigning was an adventure to begin with, but you throw a pandemic on top of it, and it's been a challenge. And so my belief is if you want to be in public office, your first responsibility is not to put public health at risk to try to get there. So I think it's just an example of Mr. Cawthorn's immaturity and reckless behavior that is apparent throughout his life, that despite what he said, early on, he said it's no worse than the flu. Clearly President Trump knew back in late January how serious this was, but you had people like Madison Cawthorn that were just the messengers, that this was no big deal. He supported suing Governor Cooper over Governor Cooper trying to be responsible about COVID-19. And, I understand it's been a real burden on, millions of Americans. But had we done the hard work on the front end, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in now. You may have seen on 60 Minutes the other night, they had a story on about New Zealand, where life is largely back to normal because they did the hard work up front and took it seriously, and has a president who's a leader. And, it's just unfortunate. So we've been doing things, we've been having some small events. We've been complying with Governor Cooper's mandates. So limited crowd size with face mask, with social distancing. We even have, Mo Davis branded hand sanitizer that we hand out, because this is no joke. And, it's easy to lose sight. I mentioned there are 222,000 victims. Over 300 of those are right here in the 11th Congressional District. And it's easy to get lost in the numbers and forget that every one of those numbers was a human life and a family that's been impacted. So my belief has been that, it's unfortunate the impact, but we can help you recover your livelihood. We can't help recover your life when it's gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. The next question is a COVID follow-up question. Based on what history has told us, especially about 1918, it looks like it's going to take us at least a year to recover from COVID economically once we figure out how to stop it and how to fight it and combat it. And looking at the long-term effects of COVID-19, especially economically, Colonel Davis, what do you have in mind to help the citizens that are being financially affected, along with small businesses, nonprofits, and the smaller institutions to recover from these economic effects?
Yeah, I believe in being fiscally responsible. My background after law school, while I was in the military, I went back to school and got 2 masters of law in government procurement and fiscal policy. And I taught fiscal law for the Air Force. And when I worked for Congress, I worked with Ike Skelton on the Armed Services Committee on procurement reform. So you always hear this, this lie about the tax and spend Democrats. I mean, for folks that still believe in facts, you can Google it and see the last time we had a budget surplus was under President Bill Clinton. And I remember I was in Washington at the time. They were having meetings in Washington because the concern was at the end of the Clinton administration, what was going to happen when we no longer had a national debt. Because, we finance our debt through treasury bills, and our T-bills are the world standard for financial markets. And so the concern was, what happens when the government no longer needs to issue T-bills because there is no debt? And then, of course, we had George Bush came into office, and we immediately had 2 wars and 2 tax cuts, which led to the Great Recession. And a lot of people forget that when Barack Obama and Joe Biden took office, we were in the death spiral, with our economy. And it's a fact, you can go and look that Obama and Biden pulled us out of the Great Recession and had us back on a path to stability. And then Trump takes office. And what do we get? Another tax cut for the wealthiest Americans. And so I believe in, my opponent supports a balanced budget amendment, which would say the federal government has to live within its means, as state and local governments do right now. But I think it shows, again, his immaturity and lack of understanding in the ways of the world. There are times when it is appropriate for the federal government to incur debt and deficit, and we're in one of those times right now. It's kind of like back during the Great Recession, where we had a pretty high deficit back then. And if you recall, President Trump, when he ran, said that he would eliminate the national debt, and it was going to be easy to do it. Well, when he took office less than 4 years ago, the national debt was $19.9 trillion. Today, it's $27.1 trillion. So we've added $7.25 trillion. And Matt, your generation is going to get stuck with the bill to pay this back. So this great Trump economy we keep hearing Mark Meadows and Madison Cawthorn crow about is a sugar high. We charged it on the credit card to make it look good, but at some point the bill comes due. So we were incurring $1 trillion of debt as a result of the Trump tax cuts that helped the wealthiest Americans. And so when the pandemic hit, and when it really was appropriate to incur debt to help Americans stay afloat, we've just exacerbated the problem. The fiscal year, the government's fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th. So fiscal year 2020 just ended. And I know President Trump likes being the biggest and the greatest of everything. Well, he just had the greatest deficit in U.S. history, $3.1 trillion last fiscal year. So, now's the time when debt and deficit's appropriate. I support the HEROES Act that the House passed. There's debate going on now between the White House and Nancy Pelosi over the scope of the bill, but as it was most recently passed, is $2.2 trillion. And I think the benefit of it is it goes to small businesses and state and local governments and first responders and the people who are actually impacted, rather than the big corporations and rich people who, have gotten richer during the pandemic. So I wish Mitch McConnell would get off his butt and do his job and bring it to a vote. They don't have time to vote on relief for millions of Americans, so they've got time to cram a Supreme Court justice through before the election. So I think that tells you a lot about priorities for the two parties. So the HEROES Act, again, another thing it does that I think is really beneficial. I'm a disabled veteran. Where I'm sitting right now is about a mile from the VA hospital where I go. And we have 65,000 veterans in our district. In order to be eligible for VA care, you have to have service-connected disability. So there are a lot of veterans that don't qualify for VA care. Under the HEROES Act, if there are veterans who don't qualify, but they've lost their health care coverage because of COVID-19, then it makes them eligible for VA health care. So I think there's a lot of good in the HEROES Act, and I wish Congress would pass it and Trump would sign it, and we could help folks that are struggling and suffering right now.
Absolutely. We'll follow up with that question with a healthcare question. In June 29th issue of Washington Examiner, Mr. Cawthorn stated, healthcare and infrastructure go back and forth, which was his number one issue. Let's go back to the Wild West. Let's let people compete for our dollars. Mr. Cawthorn has received over $65,000 in donations from Ted Cruz, who've been a leading voice against the Affordable Care Act. Colonel Davis, as a disabled veteran, what is your view of Cawthorn's Wild West idea, and how do you want to work to make healthcare more available and affordable to the people in Western North Carolina?
Well, it's easy to be cavalier when you're a 25-year-old multimillionaire who's still on your daddy's insurance policy. You can talk smack when it doesn't impact you. But for those of us that live in the real world, people are struggling. There are 1.3 million North Carolinians that don't have health care coverage. Before COVID-19 hit, there are 17 counties that make up the 11th congressional district. The percentage of people that lacked health care coverage was above the national average in all 17 of our counties before COVID-19. We had counties where 1 out of 5, 20% of the people didn't have health care coverage. So this notion that his answer is we need more insurance companies, that's not the answer to the problem. I mean, if you've lost your job and you're struggling to keep a roof over your head and food on the table, doesn't matter how many insurance companies there are, you can't pay the premium. One time he compared it to, it's like shopping for pizza, which I guess, again, since he has never in his entire life had to shop for insurance, he just doesn't know what he's talking about. So what I support is a government-funded public option, so that cradle to grave, if you need to go to the doctor, you can go. And if you're in a serious accident or have a serious illness, you don't end up in bankruptcy. 6 out of 10 personal bankruptcies in this country are based on medical debt. And I met a lot of people during the campaign that had told me that, look, I had a good job and I thought I had good insurance, and then I got cancer and I maxed out the policy. I talked to a family recently that was saying that for a family of 4, their annual premium is about $27,000, and then they have a $6,500 copay. So even folks that have coverage often, I've known people, and I've done it myself, where you have to kind of sit there and think, well, can I, just tough it out, or am I going to pay the deductible to go see the doctor? It shouldn't be that way. We spend more money in this country on healthcare than any country in the world. We average $11,000 per person per year on healthcare, and we had over 10% of our population that had no coverage. So other countries that we consider to be our friends and our allies and our peers, like England, France, Germany, Canada, on average, they spend about half of what we spend, and they cover everybody. So we can do it more effectively and more efficiently. We can also do it and focus on preventative care. Our current healthcare system is geared on fixing problems after they've happened, rather than preventing problems from occurring to begin with. So, I think COVID-19 has really highlighted the fact that we've got to separate healthcare access from employment. So if you lose your job, you don't lose the ability to go to the doctor. So I think a government-funded public option is a right route to get us there. That would still enable people, if they want to buy their own insurance, then more power to them. Or if unions have negotiated good benefits and want to keep them, then more power to them. But everybody should have the ability to go to the doctor, because it also ties in with a number of other issues like the opioid crisis, and those kinds of things. So we've been kicking the can down the road for a long, long time on healthcare. And I'm hoping COVID-19 is the impetus to finally get us to fix this problem. And it's one we can fix, and I know we can do better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very good point. We'll continue on with government programs, actually. I'm going to play a clip recently of Mr. Cawthorn on the Charlie Kirk show addressing welfare benefits.
As you know, I think that one of the greatest problems we have in our country is fatherless homes.
I could not agree more.
Yeah, especially in minority communities. I really feel like
and we subsidize
fatherlessness because there are so many financial benefits to these young women to not get married and have more children, because then they can get more subsidies for those children.
That's right.
They have. And then you have a woman who has 7 kids from 3 different fathers, and but none of those dads are around, and these children are all growing up.
So Colonel Davis, the question to you is, what is your opinion on welfare, such as housing, food, and healthcare? We've talked about healthcare, obviously, for people with low incomes, especially women and minorities, versus some of the recent corporate welfare breaks we've seen, which nearly double the amount a low-income family receives. And what are your plans to change that imbalance?
Yeah, the clip you just showed, I've heard him, make similar statements in other forums, and it's, Madison Cawthorn is presented as this rising star in the Republican Party, the fresh new face and fresh new voice of the party. But this whole welfare queen thing is something that sounds like Strom Thurmond from the 1960s. So if that's what is reflective of the fresh new voice of the Republican Party, then the Democrats got some good years coming up, because that's just patently racist, saying that this notion of minority women staying home and staying single and cranking out babies to get bigger checks has been around for decades, and it's just a dog whistle to racists. And the irony of it, the 11th congressional district is the whitest congressional district in the state of North Carolina. We have counties where 95% of the people in the county are white, and those folks, I mentioned the uninsured rate. 14 of our 17 counties, the poverty rate was above the national average before COVID-19 hit. And those aren't minority mothers out there that need help supporting themselves and their kids. And this cavalier attitude that he said he wanted to balance the budget by eliminating welfare. But he failed to mention that he gets Social Security disability income. At the time when he testified under oath in his lawsuit against Brad Ledford, he said he was getting $700 a month from Social Security, and he was on Medicare. So, when he talks about he wants to end socialism, somebody needs to ask him to define what he means, because apparently it's the check the other guy gets and not the check that he gets. So I think we can do a much better job of stopping this division and using this race-baiting rhetoric to try to inflame, passion, when we're all in this together. Folks here in the 11th congressional district, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or unaffiliated or black or white or male or female or gay or straight or, whatever descriptor you want to apply, collectively, we are all behind in so many areas, from education to broadband to healthcare to poverty, that we need to quit fighting against one another and try rowing together. So I do support, we have, thanks to Tom Tillis, we have the stingiest unemployment benefits in America. So folks, the HEROES Act, the CARES Act that ended the end of July provided a $600 a week supplement to the unemployment compensation, which really kept families afloat. And money going to families like that, instead of giving tax breaks to big corporations and rich people who just put it in their bank account and draw interest on it, families like that, they go out and spend those dollars in their community. And I forgot what the number was. I'm proud to be endorsed by Andrew Yang, who is proposing, until we get through the end of the pandemic, direct payments to Americans until we find a solution to the pandemic and our economy can get back to normal. And I forgot the figure he cited. For every dollar you put in the pocket of a working class family, there's a multiplier effect, because they're not putting it in the bank. They're going to the hardware store and the grocery store, and they're spending it in their communities. So again, I just know we can do better, rather than, this whole notion of I was at an event and I mentioned what he had said about the welfare queens, and somebody brought up, what the supplement is per child. And this whole narrative of, folks milking the system is just a false narrative, but it plays well, if you're trying to race bait and sow division.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great answer. Thank you for that. We're going to move out of the government systems into some social topics. Right now, we have a question about the monuments. Demands to remove monuments glorifying the Confederacy are getting louder, and many cities have removed or are considering removing the offending statues. On July 7th, 2020, in an interview with the Washington Examiner titled "Confederate Monument Nostalgia Clashes with Younger Conservative Views," Mr. Cawthorn addressed the issue by stating, "I understand people want to honor their ancestors, but I do not believe we should be romanticizing people who seceded from our country." Colonel Davis, the question is, where do you stand on the Confederate monument removal plans, especially in an area like District 11, where a lot of these monuments are being protected and fought over?
Yeah, I think there's some general agreement with it. This issue has come up in some of the other forums that we participated in. I think we're in general agreement that, I'm a retired military guy. And for example, Fort Bragg, is named after the Confederate general that, was a racist. And to have African-American troops have to, drive through the gates every day and serve on a base that's named after someone who fought to divide the country and to continue slavery is ridiculous in the year 2020. I know a lot of folks, it's still a passionate issue. The war's been over for a long time, and you're not going to change the result by keeping up a statute. I just don't see any, to me, I kind of always look at what are the pluses and the minuses? So what's the benefit that you derive from maintaining these symbols of our racist past? And I can't think of many positive benefits that we accrue from doing that. And when it's hurtful to a large percentage of the population that, serve the country and they pay taxes and they're contributing members in their society, and to just deliberately add insult to injury by having these visible symbols of our past, I just think the negatives outweigh the positives. And I think we ought to move on and try to be, it's supposed to be the United States. We're united and we're in this together and we pull together rather than, trying to divide. And again, these symbols are symbols of division, not of unity.
And we'll keep on the subject of social matters. And we'll show a clip during a recent debate between you and Mr. Cawthorn where he mentioned you being at a protest. We'll play that real quick.
My opponent is trying to straddle a line that just isn't meant to be straddled. He's trying to appeal to say, oh, I was a member of law enforcement. I backed the blue. But, I have a picture of him right here at a Black Lives Matter protest, which is totally fine to go to one of those protests. I believe in the First Amendment. But at that protest, they were marching to the drumbeat of defunding the police. I think that is absolutely radical to be able to go and say that, oh, well, I want to get the vote of law enforcement, but truly I'm trying to back these radicals who want to turn Asheville into Portland.
So with that being said, what do you say about the defund the police demands? And if you win, what is your plan to reform policing in the District 11 communities and redivert some of that possible funding?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. He had the picture there, and he blames me for the. A friend of his was injured at a Black Lives Matter event, and he blames me for that. And then recently, he claimed his home was vandalized by Antifa, and blames me for that. And you may have seen today there 150 of his former classmates at Patrick Henry College have signed on to a letter about his sexual predatory behavior and how unfit he is for Congress. And his spokesperson said that clearly Mo Davis was responsible. So apparently I have an incredible array of command and control that I can control everything from the Black Lives Matter movement to Antifa to the Christian conservative student body at Patrick Henry College. So, if you don't vote for me for any other reason, you ought to be impressed that I have such a, ability to command people on such a wide spectrum. Of course, all that's nonsense. He needs to grow up and take responsibility for his own actions for once in his life. But the defund the police, I don't support the label. I support the underlying notion. The other side is really good at coming up with catchy bumper stickers that people remember. And folks on my side are good at writing 20-page position papers that nobody ever reads. And so whoever for our first attempt tried to come up with something clever, defund the police was a gift to the other side. You've probably seen the ads, the Trump ads where a lady dials 911 and the answer on the other end is, we've been defunded, we'll be there in 3 weeks. That we gave them that, and they've been beating us with it over the head, and you can't blame them for taking advantage of it. As he mentioned, Mr. Cawthorn mentioned in the clip, my background's in law enforcement. I graduated from Appalachian State with a degree in criminal justice. And before I went to law school, I worked in Raleigh for the North Carolina Department of Justice and law enforcement training, and I'm a certified law enforcement instructor. So I'm not anti-police, but I believe that a better label would have been reimagining law enforcement. And I think that's something every agency ought to be doing. It used to bother me when I was in the military and you'd get assigned to a new installation, you'd get there and you'd see some of the practices and you'd say, well, why do we do that this way? And often the answer was, well, we've always done it that way. Well, just because you've always done it that way doesn't mean it's the best way to be doing it now. And so I think with law enforcement, we ought to be looking at what do the communities where our law enforcement professionals are working, what does the community want them to do? And I think there's some roles and mission that have gotten dumped on them that might fit better elsewhere. For instance, dealing with mental health issues or alcoholism or drug abuse. In my opinion, those ought to be treated as healthcare problems, not criminal justice problems. So I wish we could use this as an opportunity to, for our different communities to have a conversation with their law enforcement professionals and let's look at, are we doing it the right way? And are the things we could do different and do better? And I think there's an opportunity to do that. One of the things that, and it's interesting too, he did mention that, when I went to a number of the Black Lives Matter marches, I had folks on the right saying, why in the hell would you go march with those people? And I went to Back the Blue events and I had folks on the left saying, why in the hell would you go march with those people? And the answer is, if you represent the district, you represent the entire district, not just the people that vote for you and like you, but everybody. Your responsibility is to the entire population of the district. And I don't see anything inconsistent about being supportive of both sides. One of the things I've proposed years ago, there was an organization called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA. It was created back in the 60s. It ended in the early 80s, I believe. And if you Google it and look at it, it was not a huge success. But one of the things it did that I think had some merit, it had a component that provided funding for education and training for law enforcement, because a lot of the small departments just can't afford training and education for their, some of the communities, the police department is one person. So it helps provide funding for education and training. What I would like to see is something like, I'm a retired military guy, and we have the GI Bill. I'd like to see something similar to the GI Bill for first responders. So not just law enforcement, but firefighters and paramedics and everyone in the first responder community. Because I know quite often, particularly here in Asheville, we have first responders that can't afford to live in the community that they serve. And I know, like with our police department and our fire department, a lot of the folks live outside of Asheville and commute in, so they're coming they drive into the community, they suit up, they do their job, they get in their car and they go back somewhere else. I think part of the problem is having our law enforcement professionals that aren't part of the community. So I would like to see a program similar to the GI Bill to make, like for me, I can get a VA home loan on very favorable terms. I'd like to have a program for our first responders so that they can get home loans on favorable terms and be able to live in the communities where they work and serve. And then that way, I think there's that closer bond, and you can have that conversation on what is it we want, the community wants our law enforcement professionals to do.
That's a really good point. That's a very good point. It helps to have those service members in the actual communities. Yeah. With that, we'll talk about North Carolina values. This is kind of a two-part question. What Carolina values are you trying to bring to Washington? And what do you want to do once you get there to help the people specifically?
Well, I think, a good example of mountain values to me, I was out in Unique out in Cherokee County a couple of weeks ago at the community center. And the truck from Manna arrived, and there were probably about 30 people there. They offloaded, fresh fruit and vegetables that Manna provided, and they prepared boxes of food. And at a appointed time, people that needed some help, drove through and they loaded boxes of food in the cars to help out folks in their community that were struggling. The whole time I was there, I never once heard anybody say, "Hey, are you a Democrat or a Republican?" It was folks in the community pitching in to help one another. And to me, that's what mountain values are, that we put aside our differences and we work together. As for things that I want to try to do for Western North Carolina, and one of the points I've tried to make too is, just the reality of the matter. In addition to my opponent being clueless, he's also going to be powerless. No one is saying the Democrats are going to lose control of the House. It's really a question of how big the majority is going to be for the Democrats. And so if he's elected and goes to Washington, not only does he have no idea what the job entails, he's going to be in the minority where he's powerless to do anything useful for the district. So what I would like to do, I'll go there, I'll be in the majority. I was having a conversation with a current member of the House last week, and he was asking, what committees would I like to be on? And each member can serve on 2 committees. And I told him the 2 I wanted to be on. And he said, well, I don't think you'll have any problem getting those because they're not the sexy committees that everybody fights for. Like Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Committee, those are the ones that people, really compete to try to get on those committees. The 2 I want to be on are, number 1 is Veterans Affairs. That's the committee that funds our VA hospitals. And we have either the best or one of the best VA hospitals right here in the district. And I want to make sure it gets full funding. And we fight the effort to privatize veteran health care. Folks on the other side want to find the profit margin in every aspect of life, whether it's education or for-profit prisons or veterans health care or now the post office. They want to find a way to make a buck in everything that we do. And I want to fight the effort to privatize the VA and make sure that they have the resources there to honor the commitment that was made to our veterans. And the other committee I want to be on is Natural Resources. And the reason I want to be on it is that's the committee that funds our national parks and our national forests. And, tourism is the epicenter of our economy in this district. And it's our national parks and our national forests that draw people in. As you know, Great Smoky Mountain National Park is the most visited park in America. And I saw an article the other day saying the Blue Ridge Parkway has more annual visitors than Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, and Yellowstone combined. And during the Trump administration, the budget for our national parks and national forests has been cut 22%. So there's an article the other day about Max Patch that, with all the trash and we've got to make sure there's full funding for our parks and our forests in order to take care of them and to keep folks coming here. So I'd love to be on the committee to do that. I think another thing that, and I'll give Congress credit, I don't do that very often, but one thing they did recently that I think they ought to get credit for is they passed the Great American Outdoors Act. There's a $15 billion backlog of maintenance and repair in our national parks and national forests. And this recent bill, it's $9 billion. It's 1.5 billion. I'm sorry, 1.9 billion over five years, 9.5 billion total to work on that backlog of maintenance and repair. And it passed on an overwhelming, there were a few no votes, but it was pretty much nonpartisan in both the House and the Senate, and President Trump signed it. So that's a good thing. I think, give them credit for that. But if we keep cutting the annual operating budget, all those repairs are going to fall into disrepair. So I want to get on the committee to make sure we get full funding. Another thing I'd like to see, we have 15 of the 17 counties get PILT, that's payment in lieu of taxes. There are counties that have federal property, and federal property is not subject to property tax. And property tax is what funds a good bit of your local government, particularly education. And so federal property is not subject to tax. So to try to make up for it, we have PILT payments. And we have 15 of our 17 counties that get PILT. The only 2 that don't are Rutherford and Polk. But every other county gets, and it's depending on the acreage. But I'd like to see that formula recalibrated, because we generate $9.5 billion a year of revenue from licensing on federal property for timber, for mining, and for those kinds of things. but only this past year, $511 million got distributed back to the counties that have federal property. So I think we can do better and adjust that formula to put more money in those counties that have federal property. Another gripe I've heard from a lot of the local governments is it's an annual appropriation. So you don't know from one year to the next what you're going to get. So I'd like to see it go to a 3-year cycle so that you can have some long-range planning and stability, and you know what's coming for the next 3 years. So again, that's why I want to get on the Natural Resource Committee, because I think Veterans Affairs and Natural Resources may not be the sexy committees, but they're two that have a direct impact on Western North Carolina.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a great answer too, because we actually had a live question about which committees you were going to be interested in. So you killed 2 birds with 1 stone there. Speaking of infrastructure, while we're talking about that, as you know, Dwight Eisenhower dramatically changed America when he built the interstate system. It was called one of the greatest public works projects in United States history. In 2020, it seems like the next big public works project is going to be high-speed broadband internet that's available to everyone in both rural and well-populated areas, and as we know, in the mountains, those hard-to-reach areas. What are your plans to bring broadband internet to everybody in North Carolina, make it accessible to everybody to spearhead our economy?
Yeah, and I think for me that's at the top of the agenda. And I think COVID-19 has really highlighted why. As I said, we're behind in Western North Carolina in a lot of different areas, and a lot of that is part of the problem is the lack of broadband. About 92% of Americans have access to high-speed internet, through broadband. But we've got counties here where the official rate is 50% or less, and that's probably optimistic. I don't think it's actually that high, because the way it's measured is an example. I know one of the counties, there's a manufacturing facility that paid to bring fiber optic to the facility, but they don't allow anyone around the facility to tap into it. But the way it's measured, if you're within a certain geographic region of broadband, then you're considered to have access, whether you actually do or not. So I would say that 50% figure is probably an exaggeration. There's a bill currently pending. Representative Jim Clyburn from South Carolina introduced a bill a few weeks ago that would treat broadband the way we did electricity back in the 1930s. There was a rural electrification project that brought power to a lot of our rural communities. And Jim Clyburn's bill would do the same thing for broadband. I know my opponent has said, we need to have incentives for private industry to do it, but they're not going to, because there's no profit. And, up in some of the hollers and, small communities, there's just not a profit to be made. So the government's got to do it, because, in today's environment, broadband is like water and electricity. It's just an essential utility. And, the reason we have the problem primarily is Tom Tillis. A number of years ago, when Tillis was in the state legislature, the city of Wilson had tried to get private industry to provide broadband service to their residents, and they were unsuccessful. And they formed a cooperative to provide, kind of like the electrical cooperatives, the broadband cooperative, to provide service to their residents. And the big telecoms went to Tom Tillis and said, hey, we're not getting a cut of that action. And so we have a law in North Carolina that prohibits municipalities from forming cooperatives to provide broadband. So, when you want to know where the problem came from, it's primarily Tom Tillis. But Representative Clyburn's bill would provide about $80 billion nationwide in areas like ours, rural areas where broadband is lacking. The reason it's so important, I mentioned 14 of our 17 counties are above the national average in poverty. We can't recruit good jobs to those areas without broadband, because, in today's environment, it's an essential utility. And if we don't have it, they're not coming. When COVID-19 hit, a lot of school kids got sent home with a laptop. But if you're in one of those areas that doesn't have broadband, that laptop's a big paperweight, unless you can talk your mom and dad to driving down to McDonald's and sitting in the parking lot. And then telemedicine, I think that's a term a lot of folks had never heard until COVID-19 hit. But if you're in one of those areas that doesn't have broadband, you can't use telemedicine, which, like I said, I just did my annual physical with the VA through telemedicine. But if you're one of the veterans in the area that doesn't have broadband, you can't use that benefit. So it's essential that we fix the broadband problem here in Western North Carolina. The good news is I'm not a tech, well, as you may have known in watching me trying to sign on before we went on the air, I'm not a tech guy. But I've been doing Zoom sessions during the campaign, and we did one night. It was on broadband, and we had some experts on. And the good news is the technology is there, and it's a problem we could solve in less than 1 year if we had the will to do it. So when I get there, that needs to be a top priority. I want to work with Representative Clyburn and get that bill through, and let's get broadband to Western North Carolina.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with the telemedicine. That seems to be saving a lot of lives right now, keeping people from having to go out into public and being in crowded hospitals and places like that. So the next question we have is another social subject about cannabis legalization and reform. Currently on the NC floor, Bill 1143 looks to legalize medical cannabis and decriminalize recreational use. The question is, where do you stand on this bill, Colonel Davis, and the idea of legalization and then using the tax dollars to provide more funding to state programs, especially things like education that you've brought up?
And again, to not be unfair to Mr. Cawthorn, this is an area where he and I agree. It came up in a couple of debates, and he and I both agree on legalization, and we agree on expungement of records, because there are a lot of folks that are being held back because of an old marijuana conviction on their records. So I would totally agree with legalizing expungement of records. I think it's an opportunity too for our farmers here in Western North Carolina, another cash crop. I'm a big believer in hemp as well, which has a lot of benefits for not just our farmers, but for the environment. A lot of the products that we use, like plastic plates and cups and those kind of things that end up in a landfill, and they'll be there long after we're gone. You can make those same things from hemp, and they're biodegradable. So I think legalization has a lot of economic opportunity, as well as potentially some good environmental opportunity as well. And again, with the funding, a number of states have been doing it, where they're treating it like alcohol, where it's regulated and taxed and a revenue generator. And I mentioned before, we're talking about law enforcement. I'd like to see drug addiction treated as a health issue and not a criminal justice issue. So some of that funding that it generates could go into treatment and prevention programs in the health sector, and hopefully some of it go into education as well. So again, I think this is one where I think Mr. Cawthorn and I are probably pretty close on what we think on this one.
Awesome. And that was the last question that we had. We've got a couple of questions in from viewers. I'm just going to read a few of those really quick. One is, what do you think the economic impact is for the $15 an hour minimum wage, and how would that affect Asheville and District 11?
Yeah, there was I forget when it was, a couple of weeks ago, there's an article in the Asheville Citizen-Times, and it had a chart. It was showing that, the minimum wage has been stagnant for a dozen years, and it was overlaying it with the price of housing, rent, which has been on a steady incline over the last dozen years. So $7.25 an hour is ridiculous in my opinion. $15 an hour for somebody working full time, that's $30,000 a year. I mean, that's not living the high life, but it's a heck of a lot better than $7.25. I know a lot of small employers are concerned about if they have to pay $15 an hour, but it goes back to, a lot of the issues we've talked about are like concentric circles. They overlap, and you can't just push one button and fix something. And so it goes back to the healthcare problem. If we can decouple employment from healthcare and take that burden off of employers, and it makes $15 an hour more palatable. So I think it's an opportunity, and I support the $15 an hour minimum wage. I was really disappointed. I'm proud to be endorsed by the Asheville firefighters, and I stood with them when they demonstrated a couple of weeks ago. The city passed a provision that every city employee is guaranteed a minimum wage of at least $15 an hour, except for firefighters, and their starting pay is $11.65 an hour. And we talked earlier about first responders being part of the community. You can't live in Asheville on $11.65 an hour. So I support the $15 an hour minimum wage across the board.
Okay, and then another question we just had came in is addressing the nuclear energy, the fracking, and the privatization of the forces of Mr. Cawthorn's standpoint. What is your standpoint on nuclear energy, fracking, and privatizing of the forest? And what are your plans moving forward for energy in District 11?
Yeah, it was really interesting. He, up until a couple of weeks ago, had no real interest in nuclear energy and fracking. But if you look and see if you've been watching the attack ads that are being run against me to swift boat my record because he doesn't have a record, look at the PACs that are funding. It's funny. Somebody had a clip when he was running against Linda Bennett. He was whining about how she had all this dirty PAC money behind her, and that you should only be able to raise money from within the district where you're running because otherwise there's outside money coming in to corrupt the process. Well, he suddenly has become Linda Bennett. There's an article in the Charlotte Observer the other day. It said 71% of his donors are from outside of North Carolina. And if you look at the list of people that are supporting him, Exxon, Duke Power, Reynolds Tobacco, the insurance companies. So one of the PACs that is running attack ads against me and lying about my military record is supported by the Nuclear Energy Association and by Chevron Oil. So it was after they started funding, his campaign that all of a sudden he developed an interest in fracking and nuclear power, which are two things we have none of in this district. We do have a lot of sunshine and a lot of wind, and that's where I think we ought to go. So I'm a big advocate. I think, I mentioned our poverty problem. I think the path out of poverty in Western North Carolina is green collar jobs. North Carolina ranks second in the country in solar energy production. And I'd love to see us become the epicenter for alternative energy for the East Coast. So where I'm sitting right now, my wife and I built, I've been in our house now for a little over 15 weeks. We built a house, we put in solar. And it's been up and running. We've had one full power bill since it's been fully up and running. And it covered August and into September, which, if you recall, was fairly hot and we were using air conditioning. Our power bill from Duke Power was $16. And that's the monthly surcharge. So it meant we made all the power we used. This month, it's been a lot cooler. And the novelty hadn't worn off yet. So I still look at the app, a couple of times a day. But I love seeing those big green bars. We're cranking out about twice as much power as we're using. So I think there's a real opportunity to make green technology our way out of poverty and do something good for the economy and the environment. So and a lot of those folks out there that I found that the Green New Deal is kind of like Obamacare. If you go out in some of the rural communities and you talked about Obamacare, they'd slam the door in your face and call you a socialist. But if you said, well, what do you think about allowing people with pre-existing conditions to have coverage? They like that. Or if you said, what do you think about letting your kids stay on your policy till they're 26 so they can get through school and get established before they got to get their own policy? They liked it. They loved the components and they hated the label. And I think the Green New Deal kind of falls in that same category, where if you talk about the components, so if you go out in those communities and say, hey, how would you like not to write a check to Duke Power every month? They would probably like that. And for what they're paying for their power bill with the federal tax credit that the Republicans are trying to get rid of, and the Duke Power rebates that Duke Power would like to get rid of, with those two things for about the price of what you're paying every month for your power bill, you can put in solar. And I know for ours, they did a calculation. It'll take us about 10 years to pay off our investment. But after that point, we're making money. And so I think you can reach people if you talk about not about the environment, but about the economics and the sense it makes for them as a consumer. You can reach some of those folks too on national security grounds, because if you can make power on the roof of your house, we don't need troops sitting in the Middle East guarding pipelines and shipping lanes. So I think there's a real opportunity to develop green technology right here in our district. Here at my house, the panels up on my roof were made in America, but they weren't made in Western North Carolina. So those are good jobs, and installing them are good jobs. I was talking to someone from the local solar business today, and he was saying business is booming and they can't find enough certified technicians to do the work. And those are good paying jobs. You don't need a 4-year degree to have a good career. If you're in a trade where you can get the training and the certification, you can make a really good living. And I think, again, I think green technology is our path forward. And that's what I want to advocate for, rather than nuclear and fracking. That, geologically, our region is not suitable for fracking. And nuclear, I don't know anybody who wants a nuclear power plant next door to their house. And if you look at the cost per kilowatt hour, wind and solar are the cheapest forms of power. So I think that's the route we need to pursue.
Absolutely. And you can see the next question on the screen. What do you think about the plots to kidnap the governor of Michigan and Virginia? And what do you think about should there be a federal investigation into these groups? And what do you think about these groups?
Yeah, I think well, I'm no fan of the groups, and I'm really disgusted that we have the president who foments this kind of thing. You remember during the debate where he told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. I mean, they knew exactly what he meant. You saw it on social media later where they clearly understood that was a call to action. I believe in the Second Amendment. If you looked at my position on guns, I've got some progressive groups that won't endorse me because I don't support a ban on assault weapons. But at the same time, I get an F rating from the NRA, which is a bit ironic. But these groups there is nothing patriotic about these groups that want to arm up to fight their government. And it's a ridiculous notion too, that you think your AR-15 is going to, the government that has, computers and drones and, all the technology in the world that you and Bubba and your AR-15 is going to, protect you from tyranny, is ridiculous. But it shows, again, my opponent is makes a big deal. You've probably seen the picture of him with his big giant rifle and a pistol on his chest with the Moulin Labe emblem on it. And he's big about talking about tyranny and the Second Amendment. But again, that's a dog whistle to those groups. And that's what happened in Michigan. You had a group who made the decision that it was a tyrannical government and they were going to, exercise a Second Amendment solution to it. But it's not a joke. And you have these groups that, kudos to law enforcement for preventing this from happening. But it hadn't stopped the president. It hadn't stopped my opponent from continuing to foment division and this kind of thing. And it'll happen again if we don't do something about it.
Yeah, I agree. You definitely need to address the violence as quickly as possible. Yep. Colonel Davis, I appreciate you so much for joining us tonight. We are done with the questions. I'm actually going to give you the floor and allow you to make a closing statement and speak to those watching and those viewing and those who may be voting for you in the next couple of weeks. So I'll give you the floor for a few minutes.
Well, I really appreciate it. And thanks for doing this. I've enjoyed it. And thanks to folks that are watching and send in questions. And again, there aren't too many days left, 13 days till Election Day. So we're in the home stretch. And I'm really pleased, though. We've been doing polling over the course of the election. In July, I was 2 points down. And as I sit here today, I'm 3 points ahead. So we got to maintain that momentum. We can't do what we did in 2016 and get complacent and kind of coast to the finish. We got to sprint all the way and work for it. But I'm really encouraged. I'm grateful for a lot of Republican support and a lot of support from unaffiliated voters. I've had some Republicans tell me that, look, I hope in 2022 we got a candidate I can vote against you with, but we don't have one in 2020. So I'm happy for your vote and my commitment. The argument I've made to folks that might be still on the fence is you gave Mark Meadows 4 terms. And what can you point to that he did that made your life better or your kid's future brighter? And folks really struggle to come up with an answer. I know one concrete answer is he remodeled the bathroom in the depot at Marshall. And I'll give him credit for that because I've used it and I appreciate it. But that's about all he's done. So we're behind, and that's just a fact. So what I'm asking you for is that you gave him 4 terms. Give me 22 months. I'll get sworn in on January 3rd, 2021, and I'll face the voters again in November of 2022. That's 22 months. And if I don't keep my word or if you don't see progress being made, then it's your duty to fire me. But it's kind of like that argument that President Trump made with the African-American community back in 2016 when he said, what do you got to lose? Well, that's what I'm asking you. What have you got to lose? You can send a young man who's never had an adult job and has no life experience or education to go up there and serve in the minority and be powerless to get anything done for the district. Or you can send me. And I've got a long record that you can look at and see my qualifications, and I'll be in the majority. And my commitment is to fight for everybody in the district, not just the Democrats, but the Republicans and unaffiliated voters, because the issues that we've been talking about, broadband and healthcare and education and poverty, those aren't just Democrat issues. They're issues that impact every one of us. And so my commitment is to go and work for everybody in this district. And that's why I'm not taking any corporate PAC money. So I owe nothing to Exxon or the nuclear energy business. My commitment's to you. And I'm asking to give me, I've served, for most of my adult life, and I'm asking for the opportunity to serve one more time. And let's get the country back on the right track, and let's get Western North Carolina into the 21st century.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Colonel Davis, for joining us tonight and answering our questions. Thank you all the viewers who joined us tonight on Facebook and YouTube. And if you're listening on the radio, this is WPVM's first National Candidate Forum. Mr. Davis Colonel Davis was kind enough to join us. Mr. Cawthorn was not available. So we do appreciate you guys coming in. We're going to play a little outro video. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. This is 103.7 WPVM. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to WPVM's Asheville City Council Candidate Forum. WPVM is a listener-supported community station. We are required to be non-commercial. Instead, we're supported by donations and underwriters. We bring to the listener timely forums like tonight, local and national news, stories of community business and nonprofits, and hours of local and regional music. To do this, we need financial support, so please make a donation to support the station by going to WPVMFM.org and click the donate button.